for 2 decades, Chet work has focused on preserving the natural landscape around us. The executive director of the Gallatin Valley Land Trust has worked in various locations throughout the Western United States, gaining experience with other land trusts before relocating to Bozeman to assume his current position. Chet, thank you for joining us on this edition of the Town Hall.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Good to be here.
Of course. Well, first off, Chet, can you briefly describe the goal and focus of GVLT for our viewers?
I'd be pleased to. Gallatin Valley Land Trust connects the people, the communities, and around Bozeman with the open lands. And we do so through the conservation of working farms and ranches, through conservation of healthy rivers, like Charles was alluding to, wildlife habitat around the greater Yellowstone system, and importantly, through the creation of trails throughout Gallatin Park and portions of Madison County, what we consider to be the headwaters of the Missouri and the Yellowstone system. And Charles likes to suggested that rivers brought Montana together, and I would argue as well that trails are a pretty critical element to bringing our community together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned trails. GVLT has helped with the implementation of 80 miles of recreational trails in the Gallatin Valley. And what has made these efforts so successful?
I'd say community embrace. I found out in my research for this that now we're closer to 90 miles. The numbers just keep increasing, and the numbers of users, I believe, continue to increase. I was pretty amazed by Joe's numbers of traffic and tourists in and around Big Sky. Bozeman's been the same. Our counters on our trails in May and June showed 35% increase year over year in use. Hopefully a lot of sequestered families getting out on the land. It's continued through the summer. We're at a 20%, 120% trail use this year, which is remarkable considering everyone's condition. So we feel that the trails that we've conserved are a pretty valuable element of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are pretty astounding numbers, as you mentioned. So as both Bozeman and Big Sky continue to grow, in your opinion, how can they do so with the future of this unique landscape in mind?
Well, the Land Trust is far from an anti-growth organization. I think our work, both from a conservation and a trails perspective, is just trying to maintain the scenery, the vitality, the wildlife, the agriculture, and also the recreation opportunities for the community. So I think what we see is hopefully a spike on trail use due to COVID, but a real foretelling of what's going to happen as our population grows. And we have one trail here in town that seems to be getting nearly 200,000 user days a year. That's a pretty crowded trail. And if we can continue to find access points and new recreation ability for the community, hopefully we can dissipate some of that energy, and that goes for Livingston and Big Sky and the communities around that we're beginning to work in.
Yeah. Well, Chet, you've worked with other land trusts throughout your professional career. How would you compare your experience with GVLT thus far to that of your time with the Land Trust for Santa Barbara County and the Teton Regional Land Trust?
I feel like all those communities are struggling with sort of geographic restrictions that are causing property values to rise, working families to have to move further and further away and commute in. But having been with Gallatin Valley Land Trust now for most of the summer, I feel like this community has some resilience to that. There's going to be a lot of growth. We embrace that. Our efforts to increase transportation and trails through town, I think, are part of that. But I also believe that GVLT and the greater sort of Bozeman Gallatin communities really reflect on the perimeter of town, those parcels and properties adjacent to public lands. I think that there is such embrace from this community around recreation and scenery and agriculture that I think that there's a pretty good embrace of where we shouldn't be growing as well. We see that through contributions to the Land Trust and embrace of our work through county and federal funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned some of the differences in, those other locations that you were working in. What are some lessons that you learned from your time in the other land trusts that you've brought with you to the Gallatin Valley?
I think the trick to this business is to be really authentic. We work across party lines. We work with ultra conservative landowners and ultra liberal folks in town. Sometimes the reverse. We need to be patient. We need to be authentic. We need to be truthful about what we as an organization are capable of doing, and then we try and exceed people's expectations. And we've had a lot of success here at GVLT over the last 30 years. We've worked with over 100 landowners here in and amongst the community, and a handful of those landowners are coming back to work with us a second and a third time. And you couldn't have a better endorsement than folks that come back to work with you again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned, landowners, and one of the primary objectives of GVLT is working with private landowners on conservation easements. Can you discuss how a conservation easement works?
Sure. A conservation easement, quite simply, is a legal contract exercised between a landowner and a land trust, like GVLT or Montana Land Reliance. You've got Jordan coming up later in the show. That contract, quite simply, restricts the type and amount of development that can occur on a property. So if you have a 1,000-acre ranch on the outskirts of Bozeman, and you could put literally hundreds or thousands of homes on it, the landowner will write a contract that restricts the amount of development that could occur on that parcel. We as a community get the reward of open space, of wildlife habitat, of active agriculture in some cases. And oftentimes that landowner can receive a tax deduction for the donation they give, or actual compensation for the value of the restrictions they give up. Importantly, that landowner still owns the land. It's still private property, and they get to pass it on to their heirs and do with it as they wish, everything except exercise that development.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just touched on the funding aspect. So in that term, where does the funding originate from to allow GVLT to fund these conservation easements?
It's an important question, and one that a lot of folks want to know. For the most part, our organization utilizes funds from the county, the federal government, and some other agency funding to compensate landowners for putting these conservation restrictions on their property. However, the funding that pays for our staff, that pays for our legal advice, the time it takes for us to craft these agreements, largely comes from the community. And it's a community that sees our work as important and vital to the future of this region. And we're very fortunate to receive those funds from the community who want to see us out there building those relationships with landowners.
Yeah. Well, lastly, Chet, I'd like to ask you to speculate, if you don't mind. What do you believe the Montana landscape will look like in 5 to 10 years?
Well, 5 to 10 is a little easier. I thought you were going to ask me to reach out a little farther than that. I don't, disagree with the speculation that Bozeman's going to grow, that we're going to reach, the 100,000, 150,000. The question is where. And I believe that this community understands that growing close to town is probably the most sustainable way in order to retain our recreation, in order to retain the habitat and the agriculture that we all appreciate as well. And so the Land Trust is busy working with private landowners on the margins of town to try and conserve those properties with willing landowners, using incentives, not regulation. And I feel like a lot of those landowners embrace that opportunity to work in a proactive manner. We obviously work with the benefit of the community. We work with the funds that the community gives us, and we're grateful for that. But I think it's going to look a lot like it does today. I think the margins of Bozeman will be a little further west. I think Belgrade will be bigger, but still don't see Bozeman connecting to Big Sky. I still don't see Bozeman ever connecting to Livingston. I think there are landscapes that are too important to this community to let them be developed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for your thoughts, Chet. That's all I had for questions, but I would like to pass it off to Joe to see if he has any follow-ups or questions from the audience.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Chet, thank you again for joining us this evening. It's been fantastic talking to you and really interesting hearing, the work that you're doing at GVLT. And, something really stuck out to me.
Sure.
120% increase in trail use this year. Is that's what you said, right? Did I miss that?
Right. We're at 120%. So 20% year over year.
20% year over year. Gotcha. Are you guys noticing that having any type of, larger impact on the trails themselves?
Yeah. Trails a tricky business. There's maintenance requirements come with that burden, and the county and the city do a lot. We're grateful to have those as partners. The local mountain biking groups, hiking groups, trail running groups, great volunteers. But with every project that we take on, we reflect that there's a long-term maintenance liability that we also take on. And as much as this community uses these trails, it's very clear that we need more, and it's going to take a community effort to make sure that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, great work you guys are doing. Again, Chet, thanks. I know you need to take off, but thanks very much for joining us today. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for all the Outlaw Partners is doing. Appreciate it.
Sure thing.